You're not tired because you work too much. You're tired because you're around the wrong people. And the uncomfortable part is, deep down, you already know this. Lately, something has been changing in you. You don't reply as fast anymore. You don't feel the need to explain yourself like before, and slowly, almost without realizing it, you've started pulling away, not in a dramatic way, not in a way people can easily point out, just quietly. You cancel plans more often. You choose silence over conversation. You find yourself enjoying your own company more than you used to. The strangest part is, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels necessary. But then the doubt creeps in. Am I becoming too distant? Am I losing my social skills? Am I isolating myself too much? Because everything around you keeps repeating the same message. Stay connected, meet more people, build your network, be everywhere. As if success is just a numbers game of how many people you know. But if that were true, why do so many people feel exhausted, even when they're constantly surrounded by others? Why do conversations feel heavier instead of energizing? Why does being social sometimes feel like something you have to recover from? And more importantly, why do some of the most focused, disciplined, high-performing individuals quietly disappear? They stop showing up everywhere. They stop replying instantly. They stop making themselves available to everyone, and instead, they begin to choose distance. At first, it looks like withdrawal. It looks like disconnection. It might even look like something is wrong. But what if it's not? What if this shift, this quiet pull away from constant interaction, is actually a sign of growth? Because here's something most people never stop to question. What if the problem isn't that you're becoming too distant? What if the problem is that you've been too available for too long? Too available to conversations that go nowhere? Too available to people who drain your energy? Too available to noise that slowly pulls your focus away from your own life? And over time, that kind of constant exposure does something to you. It scatters your attention. It weakens your clarity. It makes you feel busy without actually moving forward. And eventually, you start to feel it. That quiet exhaustion, that subtle frustration, that sense that something isn't aligned anymore. And that's usually the moment when the shift begins. Not loudly, not suddenly, but internally. You start choosing your time more carefully. You start becoming more selective about who you engage with. You start realizing that not every interaction is neutral. Some of them are costing you more than you think. Because the truth is, high performers don't isolate themselves because they're antisocial. They isolate themselves because they've discovered something most people never fully understand. Not every environment deserves your energy. Not every conversation deserves your attention. And not everyone deserves access to your time. And once you truly see this, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how much noise surrounds you, how often being social is just a distraction in disguise, how easy it is to confuse attention with progress, and slowly, you begin to change. You stop trying to be everywhere. You stop trying to respond to everything. You stop trying to keep everyone happy. Instead, you begin protecting something far more valuable. Your focus, your energy, your direction. That's where everything starts to shift, because this isn't about loneliness. This isn't about cutting people off. This is about understanding a quiet truth. In a world that constantly demands your attention, the real advantage belongs to the ones who know when to step away. Chapter 1. The lie you were told about networking. Everything you've been told about networking is incomplete, not completely wrong, but incomplete in a way that can quietly waste years of your life, because you were taught something simple. If you want to succeed, meet more people, more connections, more conversations, more exposure. It sounds logical. So you follow it. You say yes to events. You stay active in conversations. You reply quickly. You make sure people remember your name. You try to be present, visible, available, because somewhere in your mind, you believe this is how progress happens. But here's what no one tells you. Most of it doesn't move you forward. It just makes you feel like you are. And that illusion is powerful enough to keep you stuck for years. Let's make this real for a moment. There's someone you probably recognize. He's always busy, always talking to people, always attending something, always connecting. His phone never stops lighting up. His calendar is full. His social circle is wide. From the outside, he looks like he's doing everything right. But if you look closer, nothing really changes. Same level, same results, same direction. Just more conversations, more noise, and slowly, more exhaustion, because being socially active feels like progress. But it's not the same thing. And deep down, you've felt this too. You've had days where you talked to dozens of people and still ended the day feeling like nothing actually moved forward. No real clarity, no real progress, just mental fatigue. And the confusing part is, you did everything you were supposed to do. You showed up, you engaged, and you stayed connected. So why does it feel like something is off? Because what most people call networking isn't about building, it's about maintaining presence. And presence is not progress. That's the part people don't see, because the world rewards visibility. People who talk more seem more valuable. People who show up everywhere seem more involved. People who are constantly interacting seem more important. But seeming important is very different from actually becoming effective. And high performers realize this earlier than most. That's why something in them starts to shift, not loudly, but noticeably. They begin to disappear. They stop attending everything. They stop replying instantly. They stop making themselves constantly available. And from the outside, it looks like they're pulling away, less social, less engaged. You say maybe even less interested. But that's not what's happening. They're becoming selective because they've realized something uncomfortable. Not all interactions are neutral. Some of them are costing you more than you think. Some conversations drain your energy. Some environments lower your standards. Some people keep you exactly where you are. And once you start seeing this, you can't unsee it. You begin to feel the difference. The difference between a conversation that sharpens your thinking and one that just fills time. The difference between being around intention and being around habit. And slowly, you stop treating every interaction the same. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Every time you give your attention to something, you're taking it away from something else. And that something else is usually your own life, your work, your growth, your direction. And the cost isn't obvious at first, because attention doesn't disappear all at once. It fragments, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, notification by notification, until one day, you sit down to focus, and your mind feels scattered, restless, pulled in different directions, unable to go deep. Not because you lack discipline, but because your attention has been trained to react instead of concentrate. And this is where most people make the wrong move. They think the solution is be more productive, manage time better, try harder. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is you've been too available, too open, too responsive, too accessible to things that don't deserve that level of access. And high performers eventually understand this, not through theory, but through pattern. They notice something simple. On the days they interact less, they think better, they work deeper, they move faster, they feel more in control. And on the days they're constantly engaged, talking, replying, reacting, they feel drained, distracted, disconnected from their own direction, and that's when the realization hits. Not loudly, but clearly. You don't have a time problem. You have an attention problem, and more importantly, an access problem. Too many people have access to your time. Too many voices have access to your mind. Too many distractions have access to your focus. And once you see that, everything changes. Because you stop asking, how can I connect more? And you start asking, what actually deserves access to me? That question changes everything. Because now, networking is no longer about quantity. It becomes about precision, intentional conversations, intentional environments, intentional relationships, and everything else starts to fall away. Not because you're antisocial, but because you finally understand something most people ignore. Your environment shapes your mind, socially, mentally, emotionally. And if you're constantly surrounded by noise, your mind becomes noisy. If you're constantly exposed to distraction, your focus weakens. If you're constantly engaging without intention, your direction disappears. And the most dangerous part is, it happens slowly. So slowly, you don't even notice. Until one day, you realize you've been busy for a long time, but you haven't really moved forward. And that moment is where people split. Most will ignore it. They'll stay busy, stay connected, stay distracted. But a few will step back. Not completely, but intentionally. They'll reduce noise, limit access, protect their attention. And at first, it feels uncomfortable, like you're missing out, like you're falling behind. But then, something unexpected happens. You start thinking clearly again. You start seeing what actually matters. You start realizing how much of your time was never really yours. And that's when it clicks. Networking was never the problem, but blind, constant, unfiltered connection was. Because real progress doesn't come from being everywhere. It comes from being intentional about where you are and who you allow into your space. Chapter 2. Why high performers start disappearing. At first, it doesn't look like a decision. It looks like a phase. You just start pulling back a little. You don't show up as much. You don't reply as quickly. You don't feel the same urgency to stay connected to everything. And if someone asked you why, you probably wouldn't know what to say, because from your perspective, nothing dramatic happened. But something changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. You started noticing things you couldn't ignore anymore. How certain conversations feel repetitive. How some interactions leave you drained instead of energized. How being constantly available starts to feel heavy. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Because now, every interaction has weight. Every conversation costs something. And for the first time, you start paying attention to that cost. Not just in time, but in energy, in focus, in clarity. And that's where the shift begins. Not because you decided to isolate yourself, but because your awareness increased. See, high performers don't suddenly disappear. They outgrow constant access. As their thinking becomes sharper, their tolerance for noise becomes lower. As their goals become clearer, their patience for distraction becomes thinner. As their direction becomes stronger, their availability becomes smaller. And from the outside, it looks like distance. But from the inside, it feels like alignment. Because for the first time, you're not reacting to everything. You're choosing when to engage, choosing when to step back, choosing what actually deserves your attention. And that changes everything. Because now, interaction is no longer automatic. It becomes intentional, and intention creates boundaries. But here's the part of most people don't understand. When you start creating boundaries, it doesn't just affect your time, it affects your relationships. People start noticing, you've been quiet lately. You're not around as much. You've changed. And they're right. You have. But what they don't see is why. They don't see the internal shift. They don't feel the difference you feel. The difference between being pulled in every direction and finally moving in one. Because the truth is, focus requires distance, not complete isolation, but enough separation to think clearly, enough space to go deep, enough silence to hear your own direction. And most people never experience that because they're always engaged, always connected, and always reacting, always available. And over time, that constant engagement does something subtle. It fragments your attention, not all at once, but gradually, until your mind is no longer yours. It's shaped by everything around you, every conversation, every opinion, every distraction. And the more accessible you are, the more exposed become to that influence. That's why high performers start pulling away, not because they don't value people, but because they understand influence. They understand that what surrounds you shapes you. And if you're constantly surrounded by noise, your thinking becomes noisy. If you're constantly exposed to distraction, your focus weakens. If you're constantly engaging without intention, your direction disappears. So they do something most people avoid. They create distance, not to escape, but to think, not to disconnect completely, but to reconnect with themselves. Because here's something most people never realize. You can't build a clear life with a constantly interrupted mind. And interruption doesn't just come from work. It comes from people, from messages, from conversations, from expectations. And the more accessible you are, the more interruptions you invite. That's why disappearing becomes necessary, not as a rejection of the world, but as protection from it. Because without that protection, you stay scattered, busy, but not focused, connected, but not moving forward, active, but not effective. And eventually, you feel it, that quiet frustration, that sense that you're doing a lot, but going nowhere. And that's the moment things begin to change. You start pulling back more intentionally. You say no more often. You step away more easily. You become harder to access. And at first, it feels uncomfortable. Like you're breaking some invisible rule. Like you're supposed to be more available, more responsive, more present. But then, something shifts. You start thinking more clearly. You start seeing patterns you missed before. You start feeling in control of your time again. And slowly, what once felt like distance starts to feel like freedom. Because now, you're no longer being pulled into everything. You're moving with intention, and that's when you understand something most people don't. Disappearing isn't about avoiding people. It's about removing everything that prevents you from becoming who you're trying to be. And once you feel that, you don't disappear completely. You just stop being available to everything that doesn't matter. Chapter 3. The energy drain. You never noticed. You probably think you're tired because you're doing too much work, too many responsibilities, too many things to handle. But that's not the real reason, because if you pay close attention, there are days when you work a lot and still feel fine, focused, clear, in control. And then there are days when you don't even do that much, but you feel completely drained, mentally exhausted, restless, unable to focus. So what's the difference? It's not the work, it's the people. And more specifically, it's the energy your environment is pulling from you. Because here's something most people never realize. Not all interactions are equal. Some conversations leave you energized. Most of them leave you depleted. But the dangerous part is, you don't notice it immediately. Because energy drain doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal. It feels like just a quick conversation. Just replying to a few messages. Just staying connected. But those small moments add up, and over time, they take more from you than you think. Think about it. How many conversations do you have in a day that actually move your life forward? Very few. And how many are just filling space? Small talk, repeating the same topics, listening to complaints, engaging in things you don't even care about. And each one of those costs you something. Not in money, not in time, but in attention. And attention is your most limited resource. Because once your attention is scattered, everything else starts to break. Your focus weakens. Your thinking slows down. Your decisions become less clear. And the worst part is, you don't connect it back to the real cause. You just think, I'm tired. I need more motivation. I need more discipline. But that's not it. You don't have a discipline problem. You have an energy leak. And most of it comes from people, from interactions that seem harmless, but slowly drain your mental clarity. Because every conversation requires processing. Even if it's small, your brain is still listening, interpreting, responding, adjusting. And that constant switching comes at a cost. It pulls you out of depth, out of focus, out of your own thinking, and puts you into reaction mode. And once you're in reaction mode, you're no longer in control. You're just responding to people, to messages, to whatever shows up next. And that's where your energy disappears. Not in one big moment, but in hundreds of small ones. That's why you can spend an entire day doing things and still feel like you did nothing meaningful, because your energy was never directed. It was distributed, scattered across conversations that didn't matter, pulled into interactions that didn't move your life forward. And this is where high performers become different. They start noticing the pattern. They start asking a simple question: does this give me energy or take it away? And once they start asking that, everything changes. Because now, they can't ignore it. They begin to see clearly who drains them, what drains them, which environments lower their energy. And slowly, they start making adjustments. Not aggressively, but intentionally. They talk less. They engage less. They become harder to access. And from the outside, it looks like they're becoming distant. But from the inside, they're becoming protected. Because now they understand something most people don't. Energy is more important than time. You can have time, but no energy to use it. And then time becomes useless. But if you have energy, you can do more in less time than most people do in an entire day. That's the difference, and that's why they start guarding it. They stop giving their attention away freely. They stop entertaining every conversation. They stop responding to everything immediately. Because they've realized something simple. Not everyone deserves access to your energy. Not every conversation deserves your focus. And not every interaction deserves your presence. And once you truly understand that, your behavior changes. You don't feel the need to explain yourself as much. You don't feel guilty for stepping back. You don't feel obligated to stay engaged in everything. Instead, you become selective. And that selectiveness creates space. Space to think. Space to focus. Space to actually move forward. Because without that space, you stay stuck in noise, constantly reacting, constantly distracted, constantly drained, and eventually you burn out. Not because you work too hard, but because your energy was never protected. And that's the moment when everything becomes clear. You don't need more time. You don't need more motivation. You need fewer drains, fewer unnecessary conversations, fewer meaningless interactions, fewer environments that pull you away from yourself. Because once you remove those, something powerful happens. Your mind becomes quieter. Your thinking becomes sharper. Your focus becomes stronger. And for the first time, you feel like you're actually in control again. And that's when you understand something most people never do. Protecting your energy is not selfish. It's necessary. Chapter 4. Strategic Isolation. The Advantage. Most people misunderstand. Isolation has a bad reputation. The moment people hear the word, they think of loneliness, disconnection, withdrawal, avoidance, something negative, something unhealthy, something to fix. Because from a young age, you are taught that being alone too much is a problem, that you should be social, connected, surrounded, that success comes from being in the right rooms, with the right people, at the right time. And for a long time, you believed that, until something started to feel off. Because despite being connected, you didn't feel clearer. Despite being social, you didn't feel stronger. Despite being around people, you didn't feel like you were moving forward. And that's where the confusion begins. Because what if the problem isn't isolation? What if the problem is the lack of it? See, there are two types of isolation. One is passive, the other is strategic. Passive isolation is when you withdraw because you're overwhelmed. You disconnect because you're tired. You avoid because you're drained. You isolate because you don't know what else to do. That kind of isolation comes from weakness, from confusion, from burnout. But strategic isolation is completely different. It's intentional, it's controlled, it's chosen. Not because you're running away from people, but because you're moving towards something more important. And high performers understand this distinction. That's why when they isolate, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like focus. Because for the first time, they're not reacting to the world. So they're shaping their own direction. And that requires something most people don't protect. Silence. Not just physical silence, but mental silence. The kind of silence where your mind is no longer reacting, but actually thinking. Because here's something most people never experience. Their own thoughts. Without interruption. There's always something, a message, a conversation, a notification, a voice, something pulling their attention away, before it ever has a chance to go deep. And without depth, there is no clarity. Without clarity, there is no direction. And without direction, there is no real progress. That's why strategic isolation becomes powerful, because it creates space. Space to think. Space to process. Space to see things clearly. And most importantly, space to decide. Not based on noise. Not based on pressure. But based on what actually matters. And that changes everything, because once you have that clarity, you stop moving randomly. You stop chasing everything. You stop reacting to whatever shows up next. Instead, you move with intention. And intention requires distance. Distance from noise. Distance from distraction. Distance from unnecessary influence. Because influence is subtle. You don't notice it happening. But every conversation shapes your thinking. Every opinion affects your perception. Every environment shifts your standards. And if you're constantly exposed to all of it, you lose your own voice. You lose your own direction. You start thinking like everyone else. Moving like everyone else. Living like everyone else. And that's the real danger. Not isolation, but unconscious exposure. That's why high performers step away. And not permanently, but strategically. They reduce the noise. They limit the input. They create an environment where their mind can actually function at a higher level. And in that space, something powerful happens. Their thinking sharpens. Their priorities become clear. Their decisions become faster. Because now, they're not filtering through noise. They're operating from clarity. And that clarity is what most people are missing. Because most people are constantly reacting. Reacting to messages. Reacting to people. Reacting to situations. And reaction is the opposite of control. It keeps you in a loop. Always responding, never directing, always busy, never progressing. But strategic isolation breaks that loop. It pulls you out of reaction and puts you into intention. And once you experience that shift, you start to see everything differently. You start to realize how much of your life was being shaped by things you never chose. Conversations you didn't need. Opinions you didn't ask for. Distractions you didn't notice. And once you see it, you can't go back. Because now, you understand the value of space. Not empty space, but protected space. Space where your attention is not constantly being pulled away. Space where your thinking can go deeper than surface level. Space where you can actually build something meaningful. And that's where the real advantage is. Not in being everywhere, but in being focused where it matters. Because in a world where everyone is connected, attention becomes rare, clarity becomes rare, depth becomes rare, and the people who can create those things gain an unfair advantage, not because they're smarter, but because they're less distracted. And that's the real power of strategic isolation. It doesn't make you weaker, it makes you sharper. It doesn't disconnect you from the world, it helps you see it more clearly. It doesn't slow you down, it removes everything that was slowing you down in the first place. And once you understand that, isolation stops feeling like something negative. It starts feeling like something necessary. Not all the time, not permanently, but at the right moments, in the right way, for the right reasons. Because in the end, it's not about avoiding people. It's about protecting your ability to think. And that ability is what determines everything, your direction, your decisions, your future. And without it, you're just reacting to whatever comes next. But with it, you become intentional, focused, unstoppable in a way that most people don't even understand. Chapter 5. The Identity Shift. Becoming someone who protects their time. At some point, this stops being about productivity. It stops being about focus. It stops even being about isolation, and it becomes something deeper. Identity. Because the real shift isn't in what you do, it's in who you become. At first, you're just trying to manage your time better. You try to be more focused. You try to avoid distractions. You try to reduce unnecessary conversations. But it feels like effort, like something you have to constantly remind yourself to do. Because your old habits are still there. The habit of replying quickly, the habit of staying available, the habit of saying yes, even when you shouldn't. And every time you go against those habits, it feels uncomfortable, almost like you're doing something wrong. Because for so long, you were rewarded for being accessible, for being responsive, for being easy to reach, for being nice. And now, you're doing the opposite. You're slower to respond. You're more selective. You say no more often, and that creates tension, not just with others, but within yourself. Because your old identity is still there. The version of you that wants to keep everyone happy, avoid conflict, stay liked, and that version doesn't disappear overnight. So you feel it. That internal conflict, that hesitation, that moment where you know you should say no, but part of you still wants to say yes. And this is where most people fail, not because they don't understand what to do, but because they don't become the kind of person who can do it consistently. Because behavior without identity never lasts. You can try to protect your time. You can try to limit distractions. But if you still see yourself as someone who needs to be available, you'll always fall back. That's why high performers don't just change their actions. They change their identity. They stop seeing themselves as someone who responds to everything, someone who is always reachable, someone who needs to stay connected, and start seeing themselves as someone whose time is limited, someone whose focus is valuable, someone whose attention is not easily given away. And that shift changes everything. Because now, saying no doesn't feel wrong. It feels natural. Not replying instantly doesn't feel rude. It feels intentional. Stepping away doesn't feel like losing connection. It feels like protecting direction. And once you reach that point, things become easier. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Because now your standards are different. You no longer measure yourself by how available you are. You measure yourself by how focused you are. You no longer feel good about being busy. You feel good about being effective. You no longer chase interaction. You choose alignment, and that creates a completely different way of living. Because now, you don't need to constantly fight distractions. You naturally avoid them. You don't need to force boundaries. You naturally have them. You don't need to remind yourself to focus. You protect your focus automatically. And that's the real advantage. Not discipline, identity. Because identity removes friction. It makes the right actions feel easy, and the wrong ones feel uncomfortable. And once that happens, everything accelerates. As you make decisions faster, you waste less time, you move with more clarity because you're no longer constantly negotiating with yourself. You already know who you are, and more importantly, who you're not. You're not someone who gives their time to everything, responds to every message, stays in every conversation. You're someone who chooses, and choice is power. Because now, your life is no longer reactive. It becomes directed. And that's where most people never get to, because they stay stuck in behavior, trying to fix habits without changing identity, trying to be more disciplined without changing how they see themselves. And that always fails, because sooner or later, they go back to being available, back to being reactive, back to being distracted. But once your identity shifts, there is no going back, because now, those old behaviors feel wrong, not because someone told you, but because they no longer align with who you are. And that's the moment everything locks in. When protecting your time is no longer something you try to do, it's something you do without thinking. And from that point on, your environment changes. The people around you change. The conversations you have change, because you've changed what you tolerate. And that's the real shift, not in what you do, but in what you allow. Because what you allow shapes everything. Your time, your focus, your direction. And once you become someone who protects those things, you stop drifting. You stop reacting. You stop getting pulled into things that don't matter. And instead, you start building something real, something intentional, something that actually moves forward. And that's when you realize something most people never do. Success isn't built on doing more. Chapter 6. The moment you realize. Most of it was noise. There comes a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when everything starts to make sense. Not all at once, not like a sudden breakthrough, but gradually. You begin to see patterns you couldn't see before. How most conversations repeat themselves, how most interactions don't lead anywhere, how most of what fills your time doesn't actually matter. And once you see it, you can't go back, because now you notice everything. You notice how often people talk without saying anything meaningful, how often energy is spent without creating anything valuable, how often time disappears without leaving anything behind. And for the first time, you start asking a different question, not what should I do next, but what actually matters. And that question changes everything, because it forces you to look at your life differently, not through activity, but through impact, not through busyness, but through direction. And when you look at your life that way, something becomes uncomfortable. A lot of what you've been doing was never essential. It just felt like it was, because it kept you occupied, engaged, connected, but not moving. And that realization can be hard to accept, because it means you weren't stuck because you lacked effort. You were stuck because your attention was misdirected, scattered across things that didn't deserve it, pulled into conversations that didn't matter, invested in interactions that didn't move your life forward. And once you see that clearly, something inside you shifts. You stop blaming yourself, and you start adjusting your environment. Because now you understand something deeper. It was never about doing more. It was about removing what doesn't matter. And that's a completely different mindset, because now progress becomes subtraction, not addition. You don't need more strategies. You don't need more input. You don't need more people. You need less noise, less distraction, less unnecessary interaction, less access given to the wrong things. And when you start removing those things, something interesting happens. Your mind slows down, not in a bad way, in a clear way. You start thinking in full thoughts again, not fragmented ones. You start seeing connections, understanding patterns, making decisions without second-guessing everything. Because now, your mind isn't overloaded. It has space, and that space is where clarity lives. But here's the part that changes everything. Once you experience that clarity, you realize how rare it is, how most people never reach it, because they're constantly engaged, constantly reacting, constantly distracted, constantly surrounded by noise. And over time, that becomes their normal. They don't even question it. They think, this is just how life is. Busy, loud, always moving, but not necessarily forward, and that's the illusion. Because movement is not the same as progress, and noise is not the same as meaning. And once you see that clearly, you start to detach, not emotionally, but mentally. You stop taking everything seriously. You stop feeling the need to engage in everything. You stop reacting to things that don't matter. Because now, you can see through them. You can see which conversations are empty, which interactions are unnecessary, which environments are holding you back. And instead of getting pulled in, you step back. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. You listen more. You speak less. You observe instead of react. And that creates a completely different experience. Because now, you're not inside the noise. You're outside of it. And from that position, everything becomes clearer. You see how people operate, how patterns repeat, how distractions keep most people stuck. And more importantly, you see how easy it is to fall back into it. Because noise is comfortable. It fills the space. It gives you something to do, something to respond to, something to engage with. And without it, at first, there's silence. And that silence can feel uncomfortable. Because for the first time, there's nothing pulling your attention, nothing demanding your response, nothing distracting you from yourself, just you and your thoughts. And that's where most people turn back. They reach for their phone. They start a conversation. They fill the space again because they're not used to it. But if you stay there, if you don't run from it, something powerful happens. You start to understand yourself better, what you actually want, what actually matters, what direction you want to move in, not based on influence, not based on noise, but based on clarity. And that clarity is what most people spend years trying to find, not realizing it was always hidden behind the noise. And the moment you remove enough of it, it reveals itself, naturally, without force, without effort. And that's when everything changes, because now you're not guessing anymore. You're not reacting. You're not drifting. You're choosing what to focus on, choosing what to ignore, choosing what actually deserves your energy. And that level of awareness creates a completely different life. Because now, you don't need constant validation. You don't need constant interaction. You don't need constant stimulation. Because you've experienced something deeper. Clarity. And once you have that, noise becomes less appealing. Distraction becomes easier to ignore. And unnecessary interaction becomes obvious. And from that point on, your life starts to simplify. Not because you're doing less, but because you're doing what matters. And that's the difference. Because most people complicate their lives with noise and call it normal. But you start removing it and call it clarity. And that's the moment everything clicks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. You realize most of it was never necessary. Most of it was just noise. And now you're finally free from it. Chapter 7. How to practice strategic isolation without losing your life. Understanding something is one thing. Living it is another. Because it's easy to listen to these ideas and agree with them, it's much harder to actually apply them in your life, especially when your environment hasn't changed, when people still expect you to respond quickly, when conversations are still happening, when the noise is still there. So the real question becomes, how do you create space without disconnecting completely? How do you protect your focus without damaging your relationships? How do you practice isolation without becoming isolated? This is where most people get it wrong. They go to extremes. They either stay fully available or they cut everything off. But strategic isolation is not about extremes. It's about control. And when control starts with something simple, access. Who has access to you, when they have access, and how much of you they get. Because right now, most people don't control access. They react to it. A message comes in, they respond. Someone calls, they pick up. A conversation starts, they engage. Automatically, without thinking, without deciding. And that's the problem. Because if you don't control access, you don't control your time, and if you don't control your time, you don't control your life. So the first shift is this. Stop being instantly available. Not forever, but by default. You don't need to reply immediately. You don't need to respond to everything. You don't need to engage in every interaction. And at first, this feels uncomfortable. Because it goes against your habits. It might even feel rude. But it's not. It's intentional. Because constant availability is not kindness. It's a lack of boundaries, and boundaries are what protect your focus. So you start small. You delay responses, not to ignore people, but to take back control. You respond when you choose to, not when something demands it, and that one shift changes everything. Because now, you're no longer reacting, you're deciding, and decision creates space. The second shift is this. Reduce low-value interactions, not aggressively, not dramatically, just gradually. Start noticing which conversations feel repetitive, which interactions leave you drained, which environments don't move you forward, and instead of forcing yourself to stay, you step back, you shorten the conversation, you don't engage as deeply, you don't invest the same energy. And over time, those interactions naturally decrease because you're no longer feeding them, and that creates more space, without conflict, without confrontation, just quiet adjustment. The third shift is this. Create protected time, time where you are not available, not reachable, not interrupted, even if it's just 30 minutes, then an hour, then more. Because without protected time, everything else falls apart. Your focus gets interrupted. Your thinking gets fragmented. Your progress slows down. But when you protect time, something changes. You go deeper. You think clearer. You move faster. Because now, you're not constantly being pulled away. And this is where most people feel the biggest difference. Because for the first time, they experience what it feels like to focus fully. Without interruption, without distraction, without noise. And once you feel that, you don't want to lose it. The fourth shift is this. Choose your circle intentionally. Not everyone needs to be removed, but not everyone needs the same level of access. Some people, you keep close because they challenge you, they align with your direction, they add value to your thinking. Others, you keep at a distance. Not because they're bad, but because they don't align with where you're going. And that's an important distinction. This isn't about judging people. It's about choosing alignment. Because the people around you shape your standards, your mindset, your behavior, your direction. And if you're not intentional about that, you'll drift, so you become selective. Not cold, not distant, but clear. And clarity protects your direction. And the fifth shift is this. Learn to be comfortable with silence. This might be the hardest one, because most people aren't used to it. They're used to noise. Constant input, constant stimulation, constant engagement. So when things get quiet, it feels strange, almost uncomfortable. But that silence is where everything happens. That's where you think deeply. That's where you understand yourself. That's where you find clarity. And if you keep filling it, you never reach that point. So instead of avoiding silence, you sit in it. You let it exist. You let your mind slow down. And over time, it stops feeling uncomfortable. It starts feeling powerful, because now you're no longer dependent on constant input. You can function without noise. You can think without distraction. You can exist without needing something to fill the space. And that's rare. Very rare. The final shift is this. Stop explaining everything. You don't need to justify your boundaries. You don't need to explain why you're less available. You don't need to make everyone understand, because the moment you start explaining, you're seeking permission, and you don't need permission to protect your own life. So you keep it simple. You respond when you choose. You engage when it matters. You step back when it doesn't. And you let your actions speak. Because over time, people adjust. They understand your pace. They respect your boundaries. They adapt to your availability. Not because you explained it perfectly, but because you stayed consistent. And consistency is what makes this work. Because strategic isolation is not a one-time decision. It's a way of living, a way of choosing, a way of protecting what matters. And the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. The more natural it feels, the less effort it requires. Until one day, you don't even think about it anymore. You just live it. You protect your time. You protect your energy. You protect your focus. Automatically. And that's when you realize something powerful. You didn't disconnect from the world. You just stopped letting it control you. And there's one more thing most people overlook. Transitions. The moments between activities. Between conversations. Between tasks. Between being on and finally being alone. Most people move through these transitions unconsciously. They finish one interaction and immediately jump into another. No pause, no reset, no awareness. And over time, that constant switching drains more energy than the work itself. So you start doing something different. You create small resets. After a conversation, you pause. After finishing a task, you sit for a moment. Before responding, you breathe. Not for long. Just enough to return to yourself, because those small pauses protect your state. They prevent your mind from being pulled too far away. They keep you grounded. And the more you practice this, the more control you gain. Not just over your time, but over your attention. Because in the end, strategic isolation isn't just about distance from people. It's about staying connected to yourself. Chapter 8. The Quiet Power of Becoming Untouchable. At the beginning, this was about something simple. Feeling tired, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like something in your life wasn't quite right. You didn't have the words for it. You just knew something was off. And so you started looking. You started questioning. You started pulling back, just a little. Not because you had a clear plan, but because something inside you needed space. And step by step, everything began to change. Not all at once, but slowly. You started noticing the noise. You started feeling the drain. You started seeing how much of your life wasn't really yours. And then came the shift. You stopped being available to everything. You stopped engaging in what didn't matter. You stopped confusing activity with progress. And instead, you started choosing. Choosing your time. Choosing your focus. Choosing your direction. And now, you're here. Seeing things differently. Thinking differently. Moving differently. And that's where something important happens. Because at this stage, it's no longer about effort. It's no longer about trying to do better. It becomes something else, a way of being. Because the real transformation was never external. It was internal. You didn't just change your habits. You changed your relationship with attention, with energy, with yourself. And that changes everything. Because now, you don't feel the need to respond to everything. You don't feel pulled into every conversation. You don't feel obligated to stay connected all the time. Not because you're disconnected, but because you're grounded. Grounded in your direction, grounded in your priorities, and grounded in what actually matters. And that creates something rare, a kind of quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, the kind that doesn't need constant validation, the kind that doesn't react unless it chooses to. Because now, you're no longer easily influenced, not by noise, not by pressure, not by expectations. And that's what makes you different, not louder, not more visible, but harder to move, harder to distract, harder to control. And that's what most people don't understand. They think power looks like presence, like being everywhere, knowing everyone, staying constantly engaged. But real power often looks like absence, like silence, like selectiveness, like distance. Because when you're not easily accessible, your time becomes valuable. When you're not constantly reacting, your words carry weight. When you're not everywhere, your presence becomes intentional, and that changes how people see you. But more importantly, it changes how you see yourself. Because now, you're not trying to keep up. You're not trying to stay involved in everything. You're not trying to be part of every conversation. You're moving differently, with clarity, with intention, with control. And that's where freedom begins. Not the kind of freedom where you do everything, but the kind of freedom where you choose what matters and let everything else fall away. Because that's the truth most people never reach. You don't need more. You need less. Less noise, less distraction, less unnecessary connection. Because in that less, you find something most people are missing. Space. And in that space, you find clarity. And in that clarity, you find direction. And in that direction, you find yourself. Not the version shaped by expectations. Not the version pulled by noise, but the version that chooses. And once you become that person, something shifts permanently. You stop chasing, you stop reacting, you stop drifting, and instead, you build, quietly, intentionally, without needing to prove anything to anyone. And that's the final transformation, not becoming someone who disappears from the world, but becoming someone who is no longer controlled by it. Someone who can step in and step out, engage and withdraw, connect and disconnect, all on their own terms. And that's what makes you untouchable, not in a distant way, not in a cold way, but in a grounded way, because now your time is yours, your energy is yours, your attention is yours, and nothing takes it unless you allow it. And that is where everything changes. And there's something else that becomes clear at this stage. You stop needing to explain your absence. In the past, you might have felt the need to justify why you weren't around as much, why you didn't reply immediately, why you chose distance over constant interaction. But now, that need disappears, because you understand something most people don't. Not everyone is meant to understand your direction, and that's okay, because growth is often quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek approval. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply happens through the choices you make every day. And the more you stay consistent with those choices, the more your life starts to reflect them. Your circle becomes smaller, but stronger. Your time becomes quieter, but more valuable. Your focus becomes sharper, but more intentional. And slowly, without forcing anything, you build a life that feels aligned, not crowded, not overwhelming, not pulled in 100 different directions, but clear. And that clarity brings a kind of peace most people are still searching for. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything makes sense. You know where your energy goes. You know what matters. You know what to ignore. And that certainty is what most people mistake for confidence. But it's not confidence. It's clarity. And once you have that, you don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to be everywhere. You don't need to be involved in everything. Because you already know where you stand. If you've made it this far, Something in this video probably felt familiar. Not just interesting, not just good advice, but personal. Because at some point, you've felt it. That quiet exhaustion, that sense of being pulled in too many directions. That feeling of doing a lot, but not really moving forward. And maybe you didn't have the words for it before, but now you do. You understand that it was never just about being busy. It was about being too available, too open, too accessible, too reactive to everything around you. And over time, that took something from you, your focus, your clarity, your direction. But the moment you start to see that, the moment you become aware of it, you also gain something back. Control. Not control over everything, but control over what matters. Your time, your attention, your energy. And that's where everything begins to change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but intentionally. Because from this point on, you start making different choices. You pause before responding. You think before engaging. You choose before giving your attention away. And those small shifts add up. They create space. Space that used to be filled with noise. Space that used to be taken by things that didn't matter. And in that space, you start to rebuild, not your schedule, not your routines, but your life. Because now, you're no longer reacting to everything. You're directing, and direction is what most people are missing. They're moving, they're busy, they're active, but they're not always moving towards something meaningful. And that's the difference, because once you become intentional, everything slows down, not in a negative way, in a clear way. You stop rushing, you stop overcommitting, you stop saying yes to things that don't align, and instead, you become precise. With your time, with your energy, with your decisions. And that precision creates results. Not loud results, not instant results, but real ones. The kind that build over time, the kind that don't disappear, the kind that actually move your life forward. And along the way, something else happens. You become more comfortable with yourself, with silence, with space, with not needing constant interaction, and that changes your relationship with the world. Because now, you're not looking for something to fill the emptiness. You're protecting the clarity you've built. And that's a completely different way of living, because most people are trying to escape silence, but you've learned how to use it. Most people are trying to stay connected to everything, but you've learned how to stay connected to yourself. And that's rare. Very rare. And once you experience it, you don't want to go back. Not to constant noise, not to endless distraction, not to being available to everything and everyone. Because now you understand the cost. And more importantly, you understand the value of what you've gained. Clarity, focus, direction, and the quiet confidence that comes with it. Because real confidence doesn't come from being seen. It comes from knowing you're moving in the right direction, even if no one else sees it yet, even if it's quiet, even if it's slow, because you know. And that knowing is enough. So as you move forward from here, you don't need to change everything overnight. You don't need to cut everyone off. You don't need to disappear completely. Just start with awareness. Notice what drains you. Notice what distracts you. Notice what doesn't align anymore. And then, slowly, start making different choices. Protect your time a little more. Protect your energy a little more. Protect your focus a little more. Because the life you want is not built by doing more. It's built by allowing less. Less noise, less distraction, less unnecessary access. And in that less, you'll find something most people are still searching for. A sense of control, a sense of clarity, a sense of direction. And once you have that, everything else becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. And clarity is what makes progress possible. So take that with you. Not as a rule, not as pressure, but as awareness. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where real change begins. Quietly, slowly, but powerfully. And if this video gave you something to think about, something to reflect on, then take a moment, not to rush into the next thing, but to sit with it. Because sometimes the most important shifts don't happen while you're listening. They happen after, in the silence.